Okay, so this is the second interview in the Trees, People and the Built Environment 4 being put on by the Institute of Charter Foresters. And today's interview is with Ed McCann, who is the Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Sharon, tell us a bit about Ed.
Ed is a civil engineer and he set up the Useful Simple Trust. He's known for being really innovative and working with multi-disciplinary teams. He also set up the Get It Right initiative to stop waste and the Expedition Workshed. Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal. Welcome to Ed McCann, the Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Thank you so much for joining us. Ed, I just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the many roles that you have.
I'm a civil engineer. My background is as a civil engineer. After graduating what seems like a very long time ago now, I lived for a couple of years in Mexico where I did a postgraduate sort of degree. And then I worked for about 10 years in water engineering, so flood defences, water supply systems and so on. After that, I joined a startup business called Expedition Engineering, and I am one of the directors. One of my projects was the Olympic Velodrome, for example, in 2012. I've worked in Brazil, Chile, India, all over the place.
And one of the things you're also involved in is a Useful Simple Trust, which seems to me to be about collaboration between different disciplines and ideas. Could you tell us something about that?
The story is that the three of us who owned Expedition Engineering came to a moment where we decided that we wanted to set up a different structure. And in fact, we set up this thing called the Useful Simple Trust, and we donated the company to this trust. So it became an employee-owned organisation at that moment. And at the same time, the founders, as we were known, decided that instead of just carrying on doing the same sort of civil and structural engineering that Expedition had been doing, we were interested in other things that were more broadly applicable to providing a better built environment. And so the first thing we did was we set up an educational company focused on how to improve skills in construction, particularly around design. And that's a company called ThinkUp. We set up a sustainability consultancy called Useful Projects, and a company joined us specialising in graphic design and communications called Thomas Matthews. So their founders chipped in and put them into the trust as well. And more recently, we've set up an architecture practice called Useful Projects. And the idea is that actually there's great benefit to the collaboration and challenge that comes from mixing with people from different backgrounds and with different perspectives, and that the quality of thinking and ideas we find is superior if you have that kind of environment to do your stuff in.
When we just work in our isolated professions, it's easy to get stuck in a groove, an entrenched way of thinking, because we've got to find new solutions. We've got to find a way right now to do things differently to achieve net zero carbon. Have you got any arboriculturalists or landscape architects involved with that?
Not inside the trust. One of our guys, I probably shouldn't mention his name, but he was an urban tree gorilla in his youth. So he used to drive around London in a van. So the story goes, is they would plant trees in the middle of the night in the most obscure place.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, there's quite a few people who do that. So I think his secret is probably safe.
He was an early exponent of the art. So we don't have in-house landscape architects and the like. We work a lot with some very well-known landscape architects.
And you're also involved with something called Get It Right initiative.
It's a cross-industry initiative that was generated or built out of answering the question how much money and waste is associated in the UK construction industry with errors, things we didn't mean to do that we did, and how much waste is in that. And we suspected, as a group, it might be quite a lot, and it turned out to be an absolutely huge number. And what grew out of a research project is now a sort of cross-industry initiative with something over 60 organisations working together to try and drive error and the consequent waste out of construction. And if to put context on that, something like 20% of all costs and materials and so on in construction are waste associated with error. And so it's a gargantuan amount of stuff that we're not doing very well.
Oh, and are you seeing improvements, less waste, or is it too early to say?
I think what's going to happen, though, there's an increased focus on it. I mean, it used to be that the only thing that mattered was the money. And there is an increasing focus, or it's not just about the money. I mean, even if you don't care about the money, is increasingly unacceptable. It seems hard to imagine why it was ever even vaguely acceptable, but it's increasingly unacceptable.
Also, you're involved with Expedition Workshed. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, so that's another cross-sector activity. It came out of looking at the way that people were learning in engineering, particularly undergraduate engineering. We're looking initially at undergraduate engineering. And again, we were struck by the fact that you have, let's say, every single lecturer invents their own course, produces their own materials. And quite often that's not their top skill. So what we decided to do is, why don't we start making some resources and innovating around how you use high quality resources that are free at the point of use. So we started doing things like videoing experiments, but using TV production quality. So we'd have arm up effectively a TV production crew and video the sorts of experiments students are shown. And then we would just put them on the internet in this thing called the Expedition Workshop, which was a website. And it's astonishing. I mean, you would have people sitting in Africa somewhere, and you would get a note. Oh, these are fantastic. Thank you very much. We haven't got any laboratories. We never get to see this sort of stuff. And here it is, I can now see stuff that I've only been able to read about in textbooks today. So we were exploring how you can learn through gamification, so games to learn and interactive stuff around to understand structural behavior and performance. And we were playing around with this. We made apps and we did online games and so on. But we were probably about 5 or 6 years too early, but there wasn't the sort of commercial interest in that sort of stuff that there is now. So partly as a result of what's gone on in schools this year with COVID, all of a sudden high quality learning resources online are even more important than they were a year ago, and certainly more than they would have been viewed as when we started doing this stuff almost 10 years ago.
And they're so engaging, aren't they? People think, oh, I've got a problem. I wonder how to solve that. I might go into YouTube to see how to lay some floor tiles. That was me a couple of weeks ago. And I thought, oh, that's how you do it. So that's a really great initiative. I wonder if you've got anything about trees on that.
We began to understand that there were different ways of learning different sorts of stuff, which isn't a very surprising idea, except when you think that when you go to university, everything is a lecture. But actually, it's not a very good way to learn certain sorts of things. And we were interested in helping people acquire a sort of literacy or vocabulary around themes. So before you can plan a construction project, it's quite helpful to know what a dumper is, what a crane is, what a skip is, what a reinforced concrete lump looks like, and so on. And you don't need to understand them necessarily in huge depth, but you do need to know what they're called and what they look like. So we built this game called Engineering Mastermind, which was modelled on initially it was top trumps, but it ended up being something different. Remember, like if you ever learned French at school, they would show you a picture of an apple and pomme. Some says it's just like that, but it allows people to develop basic literacy around a subject area. And we've done saw mechanics and construction vehicles, and we're doing all sorts of, if you go on and have a look at it, you'll see there's loads of different classes of things. It would be absolutely simple to do trees for civil engineers. What does the civil engineer need to know? We're just doing a project for one of our clients at the moment where we're going to start doing carbon literacy using the same sort of model. What do you have to know about zero carbon to sort of make sense of it and understand the conversations that you're getting dragged into?
I think with trees and civil engineering, this is part of my daily work. So I'm a chartered arboriculturalist and I work on construction projects every day. And I have deep conversations with civil engineers most days. And I always have to say...
They don't know much about trees.
No, I say, well, the tree roots, they don't just go straight down. The tree roots normally go further than the branches in an open field situation, but not at all in an urban situation. It's that they adapt to where they get their resources. If they're putting in a new road, it needs to be porous to let the tree roots breathe and water go down, and it needs to not chop through the roots. So no dig means no dig, and a permeable road surface often has a perforated pipe buried underneath it, which is a trench. So I think there is huge work to do to share knowledge from each other. So I end up having these conversations. Let's take drainage, for example. The engineer will speak one language. Oh, it's a 750 millimeter diameter manhole, and it's a private foul water drain, etc. And I go, oh, okay, so you've got that there. And I always ask my questions, how deep and how wide do you need to dig? And actually, there seems to be a real disconnect sometimes between our two professions, and it's often the game changer. For example, I carry out a lot of work in city locations, mainly London, highly complex construction in a small area, big trees, big buildings, new drainage, new levels, new roads. And I can take it all the way through planning, everything's marvellous. And then when it comes down to that design, I need to understand your problems of gravity falls and all of the things that you need to do. So how can we improve this between our two professions so that we have a greater understanding of each other?
I'd be surprised if you weren't able to, within a context of 2 to 4 hours of structured learning, get most of what you needed to do, at least to understand when to ask a question and get someone else involved in it.
Yeah.
And then in terms of how do you advocate, it is through the professional institution, we could turn around to all of our members and say, well, not all of you are going to be working day to day in this sort of environment, but for people who are, here's a resource that's been co-developed by these organisations and vice versa. So I think that's interesting as a sort of a potential area to collaborate. But the state of the art in relation to dealing with trees in an urban environment is not very advanced. And so you ask a question there about how do I dig a trench, for that? How do I do that? And you find out that for a tiny little manhole, you've got a giant great hole. Well, it doesn't have to be like that. There are other ways that we can think about solving sorts of problems if we knew they were problems.
I think that the early tree survey and good project management by the client, it's about having those early discussions and the team working things out, because quite often the two professions are working, they're not working against each other because we want to be friendly and we want to find a mutual solution. But it happens quite late on in the process. And I think some education of both of our professions, of each other, can only be for the better. And innovation, as you say, there are fantastic products around for enabling good root space for newly planted trees connected together, which presumably you're involved in.
So you've got the challenge where you're working around existing trees. But I'm involved in a lot of projects where they are effectively brownfield redevelopments or new greenfield developments at scale. Conversation is increasingly around the streets as the former of the urban environment. Historically, the focus was on the buildings, and now the critical section is the section through the street. And the relationship between the trees, the cars, the servicing in the road and all the rest of it is a very live topic for discussion at the moment. All those involved understand the real value out of having quality green space in this way. And actually, we don't really know how to do that very well when you contemplate how we overcome conceptions about whether trees pop curbstones out or knock utilities over, or whether they're going to grow up foul drains and all the sorts of things that have historically been problematic when you put particularly services infrastructure and curb edges and big stuff very close to growing trees, which are busting out of the ground. And those sorts of things, if you look online, and what you find is it's old and it doesn't reflect anything that we might do today to rethink this problem. So I think it's an interesting space for innovation. If you could find the right sort of client interest, you probably need to go to one of the big housing providers, a Clarion or Barclay, who might be interested in solving that problem or having a look at that problem. You need a demand signal. You can't expect some guy inventing route barriers to take the hit on investing and all the rest of it just in case.
I've just interviewed Green Blue Urban, and there are other companies as well to provide route barriers and route space and integrated SUD systems and systems that include the underground services. So they are available. The issue is sometimes cost. So sometimes those elements get value engineered out.
Quite a lot of those things as well, you'll find their products are available, but in a road that's going to be adopted by a local authority, it turns out they don't meet adoption criteria. They haven't got a track record in operational local authority land that allows them to be there. So this is why I say you've got to get the market right for those products to work. So it's either got to be developers who are not interested in adoption, or you've got to somehow or other work with the adopting authorities to revise the standards to reflect the new technology. All of that requires quite a lot of effort. Like all these things, over the years, we've been involved in a great many sort of initiatives to try and drive change in the industry. And there are sort of ingredients of success in this, and having a strong client demand and a driver for change. And it's usually not enough to rely on the product inventor or vendor.
Exactly. They're part of the solution, but it has to be a driver for change. There has to be appetite and budget from the client. But actually also said something which is at times a real barrier, forgive the pun, the adopting authority. So I've got a case at the moment where it's been a particular problem. So what are the issues with adopting authorities from being more creative and more adventurous if it means that we can keep good trees or plant more trees, given that those own authorities may have their own net zero carbon targets, which trees are part of? What do you think is a problem there?
In my experience is that there's a lot of fear and concern. They're confronted with something that they don't necessarily understand very well. They worry about making decisions that they don't, frankly, have the technical wherewithal. So they grab hold of the comfort of the known, and the tension between, we need to change in order to achieve these other goals. That's not screaming at them at the moment as loud as the fear of letting something through that sets a precedent, and then all of a sudden the curbstones are popping everywhere and there's a car crash because somebody's driven off the road into a tree and it's obscured a sign somewhere, or whatever it is that has led to the current thinking. And a lot of the thinking around this is about conception of vehicle prioritized streets. So, the way we have roundabouts in the UK is they're really designed to allow people to go through them without slowing down. Whereas if you imagine Spain, they have zebra crossings on every entry and exit to a roundabout, and that's to slow the vehicles down. In the UK, we have the alternative conception was we try and design roundabouts that minimise disruption to the vehicle driver. So we've got street philosophy, a design philosophy on streets, which is very, very focused on driver speed and driver safety, and have had for years. And so we need to sort of invert that and go, actually, the streets are about something else. And by the way, the tree has a very important role to play in that whole story. And so let's figure out how to deal with the car, not driving into the tree or having its view of a sign obscured, rather than just saying lose the tree.
I agree. It seems to be a matter then for policy change to make that happen. Generally, national and regional policy changes on how our streets function and what their role is. The
work that the National Infrastructure Commission are doing around design and the integrated design that civil engineers do with landscape and architects and all the characters involved in that sort of stuff is getting a good look at. And they did something earlier this year, actually, so design guidelines and so on. So I think it's an interesting moment to start raising those issues around, well, how do we design these things? But I come back to the point I said earlier, where I think actually there's a literacy challenge so that the individuals concerned can communicate effectively and understand what the issues are. But there's actually a decent amount of work to be done to upskill people and to actually develop technologies and practices in relation to this sort of interaction between, for example, trees and roads and services and so on. There's work to be done before we can be confident and the adopting authorities can sit there and go, okay, I can feel comfortable adopting this.
And so finally, Ed, tell us, why are you involved with Trees, People and the Built Environment 4?
I think the quality of urban spaces is so strongly linked to the way that flora and fauna are integrated into them, and the opportunities and need for doing this better than we do at the moment, I think is paramount. So that's why I'm coming along, looking forward to it.
Wow, wasn't it interesting to hear about somebody who's really passionate about communicating how we can find new solutions in civil engineering?
Okay, so who's next in line for the Trees, People and the Built Environment Conference?
Well, we're going to be speaking to Dinah Bornat. She's an architect who really specialises in child-friendly cities. I love speaking to her about essentially rewilding play.
Wow, sounds interesting. Okay, so we will see you at the next time, which is pretty soon actually. We'll see you next time for the Tree Lady Talk. Say goodbye, Sharon.
Bye!
No triangles this week.